Hey, everyone, good morning. Welcome to the, and thank you for coming to the Access in Science and Scholarship, a solutions-focused workshop generously funded by the National Science Foundation. We don't know why it says listening on the slide here. We've tried for like 20 minutes to get that off. We don't know who's listening, other than all of you, but anyway. Okay, so I'm Nick Lindsay. I'm the Director for Journals and Open Access at the MIT Press, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's program. The Access to Science and Scholarship report, released in November of last year, represents many months of work at MIT and MIT Press, and we're very pleased to see the spirit of experimentation and innovation at the Press reflected in its pages. The workshop is the next phase in defining a research agenda for the future of scholarly communications, and we're very pleased that you could join us on that next step. So first, a few housekeeping things. As you probably saw as you walked in, no food and drink in here, unfortunately, but it's a hard and fast rule. The Wi-Fi is there. The network name is AAS Guest or AAS Wi-Fi. I think you can connect to either, and then the login is Spectros, all lowercase, copy, uppercase, and then the numeral 1. If you have any trouble, just let me know. The coffee breaks and lunch will be out in the foyer where we had breakfast. The coffee breaks are at 10:55 and 3:15, and then lunch is at 12:15. We're on a really tight schedule today, so we'd really appreciate you coming back into the auditorium promptly so we can get the sessions going. Bathrooms are out in the lobby, past where the badges were, and then you just take a left before you get to the stairs. We have 2 microphones set up. When you come up, please state your name and your affiliation. We'll do our best to get in as many questions as we can while really keeping the focus of the conversation on the goal for the meeting, which is really zeroing in on the most important research questions and potential pilots that we can implement. We ask that people participate actively, but also help us keep us focused on that goal. The meeting is being recorded for public distribution, but only after attendees and speakers have the opportunity to be able to edit their remarks. So we want everybody to feel that they can speak freely. We'll send you a copy of the video at a point to be determined in the future. We don't know exactly when, and then we'll also give you a deadline for getting your edits back to us. Okay, let's see if this thing works. It does. As you can see here, we have really broad representation of people, publishers of many stripes, librarians, researchers, funders, federal agencies, and so on. It's our hope that this wide range of experiences and knowledge and viewpoints will lead to a more innovative and effective outcomes for our workshop, and that the solutions we arrive at are well-rounded and really considerate of all the stakeholders. This is what the agenda looks like. So we have a keynote, we have an intro, and then we have a keynote, and then 5 sessions of roughly equal length. They're not all structured exactly the same, but in general, it'll be the moderator and the panelists giving brief remarks and then opening it up for Q&A. And we hope to wrap up the whole thing by 4:30 this afternoon. Okay, and then next, so our introductory remarks will be by Dr. Philip A. Sharp. So Nobel laureate Dr. Sharp is an Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT and a member of the Department of Biology and the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research. His research interests are centered on the molecular biology of gene expression relevant to cancer and the mechanisms of RNA splicing. Dr. Sharp is a co-founder of Biogen and served as chair of the Scientific Advisory Board and a member of the Board of Directors. He co-founded Alnylam Pharmaceuticals and serves as chair of its Scientific Advisory Board and is a member of its Board of Directors as well, in addition to many others. He is also a past president of the AAAS. Please welcome Dr. Philip Sharp.
Thank you, Nick. It's an honor to have this opportunity to address you. On this very important topic, access to science and scholarship. And I want to represent in these comments the committee at MIT who assembled and issued a white paper. I'm a professor emeritus at MIT, and as you've heard, a cell biologist and been involved in entrepreneurship. I've recently finished reading a book about the early days of the Royal Society and some of the scientific advances that helped consolidate that society. And thinking about its role in the early 1800s in establishing the process of peer reviews, academic scholarship, meetings, and publication, I've been struck by the rapid rate of change in publishing over the last 20 years. And in fact, you might think that the rate of change in publishing over the last 20 years has been the most rapid of any time since that early days in establishing the scholarship. Some of that is due to digital media and the availability of large distribution of information. Some is the necessary equity involvement of the world. Some is international growth in science. Science around the world, all of which is in dialogue about contemporary issues. And others is driven by technology, and technology that's still evolving very rapidly. And in thinking about those issues, a number of faculty members at MIT got together and started asking questions about how do you plan and anticipate what changes in publication policy and models will mean in academic publishing. And being from MIT, the first thing you do is you say, let's look at some data and evidence. Let's look at what's happened over the last 20, 30 years, formulate hypotheses, and then have guided change. So we issued a report that is shown here. The objectives, as I just commented, were to present a historical overview of what open access, responses to open access and the need for open access has meant in terms of changes in the publishing industry and the availability of scientific information. And to then try to provide some key questions for further investigation. And this process is part of what we're here to do today. I want to note at the bottom that this was not an official MIT report. This is an ad hoc committee and issuing a white paper. And it's been very stimulating going through that process. Looking at the importance of the issue, research quality and integrity are extraordinarily important aspects of scientific progress and societal progress. Quality is the issue of how novel new research is, how well it is supported by the data, and how critical it's interpreted. And that process is typically and currently primarily vested in peer review. Integrity is the integrity of the data. Has it been represented and shown with integrity? And is it available and can be tested by transparency? A very important part of open access. And as we looked at those issues, we see policies that appear to incentivize article quantity over quality, stressing peer review, and we'll talk about these in a few moments, and are driving industrial consolidation. Now, these are big issues and lots of things in play, but how do you try to collect evidence and understand what changes are happening and what changes are important? So open access, which is a necessary and highly important aspect of our scientific progress, particularly in times in which we have global crisis and the need for equity approaches to progress, is a driver of change, and a very important one. Increases in cost in publishing, in the shift of that cost, is then putting stress on various parts of the community, shifting the costs from readers and subscribers to authors, institutes, and funding agents has put a different dynamics in the publishing industry. And these policies have to be viewed from an international point of view if we're interested in equity, where you have to think about scientists in other communities that are disadvantaged financially or otherwise, and how they can participate in this process of international science. As a major part of the change, and this is something I'm very committed to, peer review is a very important aspect of the quality and trustworthiness of science. It has undergone a lot of changes in terms of open access and how it's structured in open access, but it's also changes undertaking because it's now peer review of an international community, shared science, contemporary science shared very rapidly, increased numbers of publications, and the complexity of those publications is much greater now than it ever has been before. We see scientific interdisciplinary research. We see authorships of 20 and 30 authors from the various parts of the world, and how to deal with that complexity and have a peer review process, I think, is very important for the future of science. So inconsistent peer review reduces the rate in which you can actually make progress and decreases the rate of trust of the scientific community. Now, technologies have also played a major role and will increasingly so with the advancement of AI and machine learning, the ability to use large amounts of data to plan your experiment and then execute your experiment and interpret your experiment. And it's also a critical part, will be increasingly critical, in how the publishing industry uses AI and machine learning to do every aspect of publication, from detecting misconduct and plagiarism to manuscript formatting to searching databases and searching references. It's going to be an increasingly important part. It's going to put more articles out. It's going to increase the impact of science. And one of the other emerging and very interesting, emerging in some fields of science, such as life science, but has been a long-standing feature in others, preprint servers is a way to actually get information available very rapidly, widely distributed, but pre-extensive peer review. And we'll hear some peer review and how preprint service posting can actually become part of the peer review process is another question that I think needs to be thought through. And there is the big issue that's not being addressed by our contemporary dialogue, and that is data sharing. Data is the essence of doing science. You cannot make progress without data and using it, sharing it in a transparent fashion so you can validate a scientific advance, as well as sharing it so future scientists can take that data and combine it with their own work and rapidly make progress in a field. And how open access and data are interdigitated is a very important part of the changes in publishing and the changes in scientific progress. And the last point I'll make is vertical integration of services. If you think about it, with digitation and other computational technologies to rapidly share information, the whole research process can be made digitally and formattedly compatible. And therefore, if you have the resources to service the research process, providing information for planning experiments and looking at what's in the literature, understanding what has been said, the publishing process, and the evaluation process of who gets what work is actually presented and valued in an important way. If all that services is integrated in a seamless fashion from a few sources, it will drive further consolidation of publishing. And what does that mean? Well, that's a question that we can talk about, hopefully talk about today, as fewer publishers are dealing with an increasing number of articles. So some of the questions, and I won't try to elaborate on this because I hope that this meeting will bring up new questions that we should find evidence for and consider, are the effects of different open access models, how that influences publishing and the trustworthiness and the integrity of science, influence of policies on industrial structure, and what does it mean if the industry of publishing is consolidated? What is that implication for that in the future? Pressures on peer review. How do we assure quality in our publications? Quality is not just numbers of data. Quality is how creative that data is interpreted and how critical it is explained to others. Impact on researchers and universities. If the costs mount in a few sources, what does that mean for those institutions? Every $30,000, $40,000 that come out of MIT's endowment, one way is a student who doesn't get admitted, and another way. And a world of data access. How do we look at interdigitate publishing with access to data that underlies that publication and making that data serviceable for future research? And hopefully, we can raise questions here, obtain evidence, and try to anticipate what changes in publication meet the objective of increasing access to public information and data, as well as retaining the quality and integrity of science. So I look forward to the discussion and the presentations, and I thank you for your interest.
Good morning. I'm Amy Brand, director of the MIT Press. It's wonderful to see all of you here. And I also want to thank the AAAS for hosting us in this wonderful space. So I'm delighted to introduce our second keynote speaker of the morning, Adam Jaffe. Adam was supposed to be here, and then unexpectedly his grandchild was born early. And so he had to go off to Seattle, but is willing to give his talk over Zoom, and I'm very happy about that. Adam is a professor emeritus of economics at Brandeis and chair of the National Academy's Board on Science, Technology, and Economic Policy. And he was previously chair of economics and dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Brandeis. He's an alum of both Harvard and MIT, and his expertise is in industrial organization, technological change and innovation, the economics of science, and environmental economics. And there's much more I could say about Adam, but you also have access to his bio online. And I invited Adam to give this keynote because we wanted to start the workshop off with a provocative dose of economic thinking. And indeed, the title of Adam's talk is Open Access and the Research System, an Economist's Provocation. So over to Adam on Zoom.
So I'm an economist. I'm an editor of a journal. I previously been a research administrator and run a small research nonprofit. And in my own academic research, I study the research funding process and its consequences. So from that perspective, I'm going to give you some thoughts about how do we think about the research system in the context of the changes coming from open access. I should say I'm kind of being intentionally kind of provocative. So more than usual, I need to emphasize that I'm only speaking for myself and not any other organization that I may have an affiliation with. So here's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to just try to briefly talk a bit about the system of research that the open access changes are occurring in, and how well that system actually works to achieve what we would like it to be achieving. Then talk about how open access will change that, and put forward some ideas about how to think about what we might do with the research system in that context, and also some thoughts about where research could give us more information to know what's best to do. So you guys all know this. This isn't really new, but I want to have a structure that I can work with. So this is kind of how I'm going to think about this system we're talking about. We've got these things we call journals, proceedings, conferences, other things where researchers share their research results. And these are published by a mix of commercial publishers and other kinds of organizations. And the relationships between the journals and these other organizations is quite varied and complex, but they're connected. Now, if we think about how money flows through this system, it kind of flows down through this schematic. The funders fund organizations and these research organizations, and then those organizations produce scholarly output. And what I want to emphasize here is thinking a bit about what actually happens in the yellow box. There's a couple things that happen. We have evaluation and curation of the publications themselves. We have a kind of certification of the quality of those publications, and that certification is important for a variety of reasons. And then we have these organizations called publishers, which historically did something very physical. They typeset and printed volumes of paper and physically distributed those. And it's through that the knowledge that was produced by the researchers is then disseminated back to researchers, to the funders, and to everybody else. So that's how I think about sort of what it is that's actually happening in this system. Now, if we think about the money, it flows down in the picture from the funding agencies to the researchers, and then from both research institutions and researchers to the people who do the publishing. Open access, of course, is going to change that, and we'll come back to that. So let me just, before I do that, just comment a bit on this system and think about it. As I said, we used to have this physical publishing function, which was quite resource intensive. And in that world, we developed the subscription model where the people who subscribe to these journals cover those costs. But what we've inherited is a world in which publishers, and many of which are for profit, not all, but many, hold these important journal titles, which gives them market power that allows them to make choices that we may not think are the best choices. And now, for well-funded institutions, the agencies that fund them really cover the cost of dissemination of research. They do it indirectly, but libraries and the ITS are part of overhead that's paid for out of research grants. Institutions without research funding and unaffiliated researchers may have more trouble accessing the output that has been funded through public money. Now, going back to this editing reviewing function, we have these people called editors and referees who provide the review and the curation of the journals, and they do it largely without compensation, certainly without market compensation. They do this as part of their professional responsibilities. We've had an explosion in the rate of publishing, which is really straining this system in a variety of ways. We actually don't know very much about how well this system really works. We don't really know to what extent this whole process really improves the quality of the published papers. We don't know how good it is at actually choosing the best papers. We haven't really thought about whether it's an efficient way to use the time of the reviewers. And then in the background, we have this issue of AI, which is a huge wild card that is potentially affecting both the production of the publications themselves and also the review process. And I'll come back to that briefly. Now, on the other side, from the perspective of the researchers and their institutions, we have this situation where getting your papers placed in the best journals is in many ways the primary professional focus of many scholars. And we have this, from my perspective, somewhat odd system in which the research institutions, universities, and other academic organizations essentially are outsourcing to a significant extent the professional evaluation of their employees to the journals. And this process is kind of weird. It's indirect. We don't really know to what extent what the journals are evaluating is what the institutions want to be evaluating. But this system is very entrenched. It would be very hard to change because there's so much in the system that is built around the way this has always, or not always, but has worked for many decades. Okay, now let's think about open access in this context and think about what it does. So the revenue that flows from the research institutions to the journals in terms of subscriptions is going to fall and be replaced by different kinds of streams. Unaffiliated researchers will no longer need to pay for access, but the research institutions and the researchers are paying and are going to pay a new kind of fees, publication fees, these green arrows, which will in some sense replace the subscription revenues in supporting the operations of the reviewing process and the so-called publication process. Now, it's not a given that this can't work. I mean, it can work. We could achieve a new kind of equilibrium that in many ways would be pretty similar to what we had before. As subscriptions fade away and we move to open access, publication will be supported by these publication fees. The funding agencies would have to ensure that the funding they provide and the overhead formulas they use provide the resources to pay these fees. The journals and the publishers could move to entirely open access, and you could evolve a system of protocols that basically says that people who can afford it pay publication fees. Those fees cover all the costs of the system with essentially a cross subsidy from funded researchers to unfunded researchers or poorly funded researchers, so that in the aggregate, these publication fees cover the costs of review and publication. And crucially, the role of publication in professional advancement for scholars would not necessarily need to change in a world of open access. But I want to argue that we shouldn't waste this opportunity. We have an existing system which is basically based on old institutional needs. In some sense, we're still living in Vannevar Bush's world, which was shaped very much by thinking about World War II, about how we should fund research and what the relationship is between the government and the research enterprise. And there are indications that this system, is not necessarily working great. The publishing game is really quite ugly. As I mentioned, we have this sort of fixation by researchers on just getting their papers in the top journals. Increasingly, we have papers being written by chatbots. We have so-called predatory publishers. You can buy publication of a paper. We have academic fraud. I'm not really sure whether it's worse than it used to be, but it definitely is an issue and is to some extent seems to be driven by this pressure to publish at least in part by this pressure to publish in these top journals. We have referees who are overworked and are getting harder and harder to find. And because we've had this explosion in the amount that's published, we have to accept the reality that although we think we have this peer review process, really only a very small fraction of published papers are actually carefully checked and edited. It's just not resource possible to really do careful review of all of the papers that are in some sense getting published. And on the other side, I think it's fair to say there's an increasing sense of some kind of discomfort over the way in which the promotion process does rely on bibliometric measures of publication, possibly to the exclusion of qualitative understanding of what scholars are really doing for the institutions they work for. So these are all, for me, reasons why even before we had open access, we might think that the system we have is not the system we would choose if we were designing it from scratch. So let me put forward some new thoughts in a couple of different categories. My first thought is let's just separate the idea of dissemination of research results from evaluation of those results. We could broaden what we now typically call preprint servers. That's kind of an anachronistic title for them, but so we call them. They could just be the way papers get published. We could just evolve a system in which anytime I write a paper, I put it on a server, I put it out there. We had a bit of a precedent for this way of thinking about things for COVID research during the pandemic. But we could make this the norm. Now, you could still have publishers which could try to market edited, curated work. It would have already been published in open form, but they could try to market improved versions of it. Authors wouldn't pay to get their works published in these publications, but if the publications themselves are valuable, then institutions, individuals would voluntarily pay to get this stuff. But the publishers wouldn't have a captive hold on the primary research output. It would all be posted for free, so that in some sense everyone would have access. Now, in this world, we have to take account of the fact that if we just publish all this stuff, we just put it out there, we do have these crucial functions that we need to think about. And it is socially valuable to have domain experts, what we call referees, to opine about which work is the most important. We've all got stories about how important papers had trouble getting published, so the curators do get it wrong sometimes. But overall, this process makes ongoing absorption and application of the work more efficient. And further, research institutions need some way of evaluating the quality of their researchers for hiring and promotion. So we have to think about, if we're going to go to a world in which everything is just put out there, how would these things happen? I don't really know the answer to that, but I don't see any reason why new institutions couldn't evolve that would do this. The universities, scholarly societies, professional organizations all have incentives to do this and are sort of positioned to do it. The professional input that scholars are currently providing through refereeing could be sort of reorganized to do the same thing in new ways, not in connection with publication, but in connection with a more generic curation and review process. This could be facilitated by AI. I'm certainly not going to argue it could be done by AI, but I think AI could help with it. And all of the money that we now pay to publishers could be redirected to these new organizations, new management structures, new modes for evaluation. So it's not like this would have to happen without any resources. We have significant resources in the system that are doing this now and could do it under new structures or in new forms. So, let me say, I've thought about this for some time, but I have not done a careful study of this. My thinking is mostly driven by the natural and social sciences. I think this probably applies to humanities and academic arts, but that would require a little more thought because it's books more than papers, and that's a different kind of thing. And so that would require some thought. I haven't done any real cost calculations, but as I've said, we have a lot of money that's now going to academic publishing, and that could be redirected, which at least in some sense, I think could play a major role in helping this happen. Obviously, the transition would be a nightmare. I don't know exactly how this would happen. You'd have to have some process by which universities sort of and other organizations kind of gradually wean themselves from reliance on just looking at where papers were published in order to evaluate people. But I think that could eventually happen. I'm not making sort of a specific action proposal here. I just think it's worth thinking about as we are upending the system anyway for other reasons, whether we want to try to keep everything else intact or we want to make bigger changes. Now, I think there are things that we don't know that we'd like to know as we sort of build a new system. We don't really understand what journals actually do, how much the editorial process really does improve the process, and perhaps most important, under what circumstances does it really improve the process and have a large added value. How does the research community use publications that are just put out on preprint servers? I've kind of assumed that you've got dissemination if you've got posting on a server, but obviously actually absorbing and reusing uncurated waves, tsunami of publications is not a trivial matter. So we would need to understand how that might work and how it might be facilitated. We don't really understand how well what referees and journals are now doing in terms of evaluating publications really matches with what institutions do or should care about in terms of the quality and success of their researchers. And then I think a big open question here is the potential for AI to facilitate this curation and evaluation process and allow it to be done potentially more efficiently. So just to wrap up, I just want to emphasize that we've got these things called publishers today who have kind of a vestigial role that was created in a different world with a different technology. I don't think in many ways that historical function is still needed, but they're still there and they own the journal names. And we have this sort of sacrosanct process of if you get a journal publication in Nature or Science, you're supposed to get promoted. And that's not going to be easy to change. But to me, this whole idea of curation and dissemination of ongoing research is a quintessential public good. It's something that as a society, we really should care about, really for the same reasons we care about research itself and the public support of research. And it's a little weird that we've accepted that the government needs to fund the research, but we have historically left this crucial process of curation and dissemination to a private process with sort of historical origins. So I just like to suggest that that's worth thinking about. So thank you. And I don't know quite how this is going to work, but I'm told that you're going to be able to ask some questions and I will try to respond.
Yes, thank you. Christine Borgman, UCLA. There actually has been a very large amount of study on peer review, which could be brought into this process. My specific question is, though, where you concluded is the commons goods problem. And as an economist, it would be very helpful if you could reflect more on that, because a big part of our issue here is the free riders and all the other things that go with commons goods. So how do we get around the free rider problem and other parts of the commons model?
There are many potential free rider problems in this system. We have it today. Why do scholars agree to referee papers when they're not getting paid? And if they don't do it, someone else will do it. I think that we need a combination of thinking about where we really do need to compensate people for doing things, because otherwise free riding is too big a problem, while at the same time recognizing that our whole scholarly system sort of relies on scholars feeling professional obligations to do the things that need to be done for the scholarly system to operate. So I think it is definitely an issue that we need to be cognizant of and think about. At the same time, we recognize that human organizations solve free rider problems all the time, essentially by people feeling obligations to do things that they need to do for the profession.
We have time for one more.
Sure. Art Ellis, I'm an advisor with Elsevier. I appreciate very much, Adam, the sort of system-level look. And one of the things that we're seeing is that funders are beginning to put some of the funding into really societally based research agendas. If you think about place-based investments that NSF's new director at TIP is making, the innovation hubs from the Department of Commerce. And I'm wondering if that could lead to more of a sharing set of incentives, that this is information that's put out there that others can use, and there are incentives for having it picked up by others. Could that change the culture in such a way that it would trickle into these other elements you're talking about in the economic model? Thank you.
Well, I think potentially we saw, as I mentioned, we saw spontaneously during the early days of the pandemic an evolution of a norm of sort of immediate dissemination of research results rather than them going through the normal review process, which I think was a sort of endogenous response to a sense that this was a huge social need. So I do think that the system can respond to perceived social needs, and that does change the way scientists and other actors in the system think about their roles. Of course, the pandemic was a quite literally, I hope, once in a lifetime situation. The extent to which more generally the system will respond to the fact that research is needed for social objectives, such as, say, climate change, I think is an open question. As I said in my answer to the question about free riding, I think these systems respond to a combination of personal incentives and social incentives, and that's a little hard to predict. But they're all part of the system.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. So